What is the worst book you've ever read? 50 Shades of Grey. Poorly written, has no substance whatsoever besides the fact they can find new ways to describe genitalia. You all have never read anything self-published by an aspiring novelist who isn't very good. The Jakarta Pandemic. Stephen Conkley. It was pornography for middle-aged libertarian preppers. All about a global pandemic and how the hero prepper of the story is a hero who defends his home and bangs his hot wife all the time while fighting off looters before banging his hot wife some more. Did I mention he bangs his wife who is very hot? Because he does. The After series, which was originally a Harry Styles fanfiction which was later published and then made into multiple movies. Both the protagonists are horrible people and it's just one old toxic trope after the other. It'll make you pull your hair out. A total train wreck. I mostly read non-fiction, where what's bad can be a little different than fiction. The worst was a certain James Stewart biography. It had so many errors and it was obvious the author hadn't actually watched some of the movies he was talking about. Plus there was a lot of weird slut-shaming for certain actresses who were more sexual-free in the 30s and 40s. I hated The Notebook. A coworker brought in her copy and pushed it on me because she saw me reading poetry once. It was the shittiest contrived garbage I've ever read and the last paragraph felt pretty goddamn gross. Nicholas Sparks can eat a quarter-mile of dick. I was on an airline flight once as a child and was seated away from my family. I was a bookworm, and the woman seated next to me took note and told me she was a children's author. She handed me a copy of her new book and was eager to hear my thoughts on it. That shit sucked. Of course I felt obligated to read a good amount of it and pretend I enjoyed it. It was a generic children's fantasy story with an obvious author insert character. I wonder where she is today. Thinking face. The subtle art of not giving AFCK. And I paid airport retail for that, too. Gack. Not everyone should write. Introduction to Multivariable Calculus 12th edition. The IKEA book on how to put my dresser together. My Immortal is book length. Screeching teenager Harry Potter fiction. Ready Player 2 was absolute dog shit. I was actually a big fan of the first book and was excited to see these characters now older on a new adventure. Instead what we got was a meandering mess that goes nowhere and is just an excuse for the characters to do more of the same but worse from the last book. Also it retcons one of the side characters into being a manipulative sociopath when he was just a misunderstood fool in the first book. The Butcher and the Wren by Elena Urquhart. It was poorly written, like a half-assed essay written by a high schooler. Jaws is awful. Beyond awful, and the movie is so good I don't know how the two are related. The books about sex, relationships, and marriage written by evangelical Christian authors. There are certainly good books about sex and marriage from a Christian perspective, but the majority of them are just awful. The shit they teach is delusional, harmful, and most often based on stereotypes. The Scarlet Letter. It's one long, boring run-on sentence. Ready Player 2. 50 Shades of Grey. Never got the hype. It was pretty poorly written and the author used the same phrases over and over again. Verity by Colleen Hoover. Anything by Colleen Hoover has been removed from my to-read list because of the utter shit Verity was. Toss-up between Twilight and the Cursed Child. The Book of Mormon. I grew up being taught that it was God's inspired word and read a chapter every night out of obligation. I used to think I hated reading because I had to force myself to read it. I wondered how the inspired word of God could be so mind-numbingly boring. Plus I had to reread most verses 2 or 3 times to make sense of them because they're so grammatically poorly written, filled with run-on sentences, contradictions, and incomplete thoughts. 0-10 foot. We Were Liars. I could literally go on for hours about this book, but to say this as concisely as possible: insufferable main character, pretentious and inconsistent writing style, next to no plot, and twist ending that can be seen from a mile away. Also, it's sold as a psychological thriller, but it's definitely a romance novel that thinks it's cool, and you can't convince me otherwise. Scarlet Letter. A Miserable Time in American Lit in HS. Ethan Frome and his stupid boring pickle dish. Earth's Last Citadel. A pulp novella from the 1940s, early 1940s, about an American spy who is sent forward in time with two Nazis, one of whom is apparently a hot Irish woman and a Scottish scientist, and ends up destroying the god figure of the desiccated and helpless future mankind while being hunted by a smoke-based alien who is allergic to sound. It's like if someone read both A Princess of Mars and The Time Machine and went to that, but shittier. It was only 130 pages and I had to force myself to finish it out of spite. The Left Behind series. My mum had them in her bookcase, so I read them when I was at home caring for her when she was ill. They start off okay, then descend into preachy, padded chapters about tangential characters I couldn't gaff about. They actually managed to make the return of Jesus boring. Having read the Screwtape Letters, it was clear just how inferior a work of Christian apologetics it was. Utter trash. I don't remember the title of the worst book I ever read, but I had heard so much praise about Atlas Shrugged that when I found a cheap copy of it at Goodwill I bought and read it. Or forced myself to read about 50 pages of it, waiting for the good part to kick in. I found it boring, and I threw it in the trash. I usually don't throw books away, but other than the one I can't remember the title for, it's one of 3 books I ever threw in the trash instead of donating because I didn't think it was fair to make someone else suffer through it. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Nope. Wicked. The one that inspired the musical. Twilight. Lords above, is that book rubbish? My GF at the time talked me into giving it a shot. It was poorly penned, creepiest romance since Lolita, and invoked no emotional response with its complete lack of character development. I'm not sure any non-English speaker will recognize it. It's called Juventud en Ecstasis. Growing up in 90s Mexico, it was a mandatory read where I went to school, and many other schools, whatever you call the year when students are 13 or 14 years old. It's basically a book trying to indoctrinate kids, trying to scare us from trying alcohol, sex, drugs, etc. There's a sequel to it, forgot the name of it, but it goes deeper into the sex is scary thing, pregnancy, and abortion. Hilariously bad, pretty much propaganda. Go Set a Watchman. Odd that my favorite book and least favorite book are by the same author. Anything by Colleen Hoover. I will never understand the hype around her books. I felt like I was back reading fanfiction about One Direction when I tried to read Verity. Couldn't get through the first chapter. Probably the absolute worst were my 11th grade history aka political propaganda, conspiracy theories, and blatant lies textbook. Thanks, Abika, and the absolutely horrid religion textbooks I had to read at Liberty University online. It felt like drinking swamp water, and the leaps of logic or rather lack thereof make one wonder how the authors even managed to dress themselves. Gravity's Rainbow. I think it is the only book I ever started and just gave up on. I know it won a lot of awards and is considered a masterpiece by some, but I just could not get into it. Honestly, any of the right-wing conservative dribble is fucking awful, but I listened to some of Ben Shapiro's True Allegiance and it is fucking hysterical. Wuthering Heights. The Witch of Portobello by Paulo Coelho. I hate it and I hate the main character. Hands down it has to be Wuthering Heights. It took me 3 tries, and I hated every minute. I will never understand why it's such a great love story. Heathcliff and Cathy were absolutely toxic, and there wasn't anything redeeming about them or their love-hate.